Okay, we are in John Law's office. That you can see it's a fantastic place. John, okay,
Here.
so tell me the whole story of the Suicide Club and Cacophony Society and so forth.
You want me to tell you the whole story of the Suicide Club and the Cacophony Society? What?
Music.
Oh, no music? Yeah, okay. Hang on a second here. Wow, voila. Well, I wrote a 320-page book with two other people that covers about 3% of it. So where do you want to start?
I want to well, tell me about San Francisco in the late 70s or even mid 70s or even early 70s, wherever you want to start.
Well, I came here in 1976. My family was here in 67, that's right. And my father, he was a college professor from a working class background, and he was taking a summer course at Santa Clara College, which is down in Santa Clara. It was a Catholic college, and he was taking a computer course of all things in 1967, summer 67. And so that's the first time I became aware of San Francisco, because we were staying down the peninsula, and we would drive to the city occasionally, and it made a big impression. Several things made a big impression on me coming here as a 9-year-old kid. We were in the proverbial suburban station wagon with a family, 2 girls, 1 boy, parents.
Which town did you grow up in?
Well, I was born in California in San Luis Obispo, but when I was 4, we moved to Mississippi, Oxford, and then when I was 5, we moved to Big Rapids, Michigan, which is where I grew up. I grew up in Michigan, so very Midwestern in my quirks. So, but anyway, so while we were in Michigan, we came back here to Santa Clara, and we were here for 4 months, and that's when I first became aware of San Francisco. And that's really why why I ended up out here is because of that trip. That trip when I was 9 years old. Because when we would come up to San Francisco, the handful of times we came up here, my father intended the trip in some respects to be a cautionary tale for the family, because San Francisco in 1967 was the height of the media saturated hippie movement, and so it was all over the news, and there were tens of thousands of kids had shown up in San Francisco that summer, and there was this monolithic view of what it was in the media, this sort of weird monolithic view of what being a hippie was, and that whole thing was in the media. Of course, there's a whole image of what it meant to people who were, middle class families like my family, and it was, there were a lot of mixed signals from this whole scene. But anyway, so we drove up here in the station wagon, brand new, nice, big, happy family station wagon, and my father wanted to drive down Haight Street to look at the hippies, somewhat as though we were going to the zoo. I think that's how he viewed the whole thing. And so we come to Haight Street. I don't know, 9. I don't remember how we got there, but we got there in the car, and then my father and sister, we rolled the windows up. So we rolled the windows up, and so we're literally in this caravan, because this would have been in June or July probably of '67. So we're in this caravan of like suburban cars, just like ours, for people coming to San Francisco to look at the hippies, because it was a big thing to do then. And I know about this now because since living in San Francisco for 40 years, I've gotten to know a lot of people who were part of that scene. I knew Chet Helms and Jack Davis and some other folks who came, like 10, 15, 20 years older than me, who were there at that time. And so I've heard about, I've read about that period, so I know what was going on. So we were literally part of this suburban caravan to go down Haight Street looking at the hippies. And I remember vividly looking out the windows and seeing all these people who seemed to be having a really good time, and they all looked kind of dirty. And my father, who was quite liberal in certain respects, was quite conservative in other respects, and he was commenting, constantly on this horrifying wash of like pathetic humanity. Get a job, what are these bums doing out here? And I look at it, and it just looked to me like they're having a lot of fun. And I remember my older sister, who was 15 at the time, rolled the window down, 8, 15, 16, rolled the window down and got a flyer from one of these guys, possibly an Oracle, who knows what it was, but some hippie flyer, which sort of annoyed my father. And so I just remembered that vividly. The other things I remember in San Francisco were the buffalo paddock, where there were all these buffalo that you could see in Golden Gate Park. They were kind of like the hippies, only they had 4 legs, and and Golden Gate Bridge. I remember the Golden Gate Bridge vividly because it was just such an impressive thing. We went there and drove over it to Marin County. So that's what I remember. So, and that was in the back of my head. And then many, many years later, well, not that many years later, but would have been 8 years later, I skipped juvenile probation and ran away from home. And we lived in Johnson City, Tennessee at that time. We'd moved to Tennessee after 10 years in Michigan. And I barely made it out of high school. And I got a scholarship to go to college, University of Tennessee at 16. So I went, and within 3 months I completely blew the scholarship and got thrown out of school. And I was also in a lot of trouble, got into a lot of trouble, was on juvenile probation. Anyway, it's a long story. And I ended up running away, went back to Michigan to hang out with my friends for a few weeks, and then I hitchhiked to San Francisco because I had this image in my head of this is where you go if you want to do whatever you want. Like this sort of licentiousness that I assumed was the currency here. And so I came here hitchhiking with no money. My friend Kenny Unger and I hitchhiked out here and met, and we slept in his brother's porch in Berkeley, and then he left, and then I ended up sleeping in Golden Gate Park in a sleeping bag for about a week, 2 weeks, and drinking coffee and playing chess at these two little cafes on Hayes Street, a couple blocks up from Hayes Street, the Blue Unicorn and the Sacred Ground, which is still there, like 40 years later, and the coffee shop's still there, believe it or not. Pretty miraculous. And it hasn't changed at all, which is really weird. But anyway, so I was there and panhandling on Market Street, and then I got a job, and I was able to stay in a youth hostel even though I didn't have any money. I'd wash dishes and clean up. And then me and some other guys there got an apartment on Haight Street, Cole and Haight. We rented a big, giant apartment with 4 bedrooms for like $200 a month. And then we let everybody we knew stay there for free. I was 17, and I was like, woohoo, here I am. I'm ready to party. I'm in the Haight-Ashbury. Let's go. And so everybody I met on Haight Street were alcoholic, drug addict bums, pretty much. And not everybody, but most people were. And I'm like 17, and I'm ready to do stuff and change the world. And all these old toothless hippies are telling me that, I've told this story many times, but they're telling me, well, you missed a party, kid. The party was like 8 years ago. Party was 8 years ago, and I've never, ever, ever forgotten that. And every time, fuck them. I mean, within a year, I was in the Suicide Club, and the punk scene started, and we were having as much fun as any hippie ever had, probably more fun than any hippie ever had. But we were making it, And so whenever, I guess there helped Burning Man get started and was involved in a lot of other really interesting things that people have an interest in now. That wasn't the intent when we were doing that stuff. But now, like, so if a kid asks me, well, or he says, oh, I wish I'd been around when Burning Man was started. I'm like, fuck that. That was like then. That was a million years ago.
So who started the Suicide Club? Who started the Suicide?
The Suicide Club was started in January, February of 1977, and it was an outgrowth of Communiversity, and Communiversity was part of the free university movement, part of the hippie movement, one of the more interesting experiments, that period. And the people who were behind the Suicide Club were also the administrators of this free university, Communiversity, which had been an adjunct of SF State. It had been an official program at San Francisco State starting in 1970. 70, I think it was 70 or 70, yeah, 70. And then Gary Warren took over as this paid student administrator, paid small stipend by SF State, probably in 73 or 4. And he and Shirley Sheffield and Kathy Hardy and a few other people were managing this free university that was taking place it had an office on the campus at SF State, and then they would have classes in people's homes, in classrooms, wherever. The classes were free. Anybody could list a class. The class could be anything you wanted it to be. It could be serious or frivolous or anything. There was a lot going on with the free university movement at that time, and it's very poorly recorded. There's very little online about it now. But it was a big deal for several years, many years. At that period, and so
not all in this area, right? It was
all across the country, and it was near as I'm able to tell from reading up on it and from talking to older fellows, folks who were involved, it was in kind of a way it was a response that the university system initially had to the student unrest at the time. They're trying to think of ways. Administrators were trying to think of ways. Well, how do we engage students? Well, and then this free university movement came up, inspired by the free speech movement from Berkeley in '64. The first free university started in '65, including I can't remember the name of it anymore. There was a different free school at SF State University, the Open University, or something I can't remember. Anyway, it started in '65 at SF State, ended, and it died in '69, and then a new one was started called Communiversity in '70. And that's the one that I was involved in later, and that's the one that the Suicide Club came out of. So anyway, this movement was a way to engage people, and I think all the different iterations of free universities around the country were probably largely took on the personality of the people who ran them to some degree. They weren't locked down, hierarchy. There was no like rule for across the board rule that this is what you have to do to be a free university. So I think some of them were facades for political organizations. I think some were more decidedly educational in their construct and in their purview and their purpose. And some were like Communiversity. Communiversity took on to some degree the personality of the people that were administering it, Gary Warren and his friends, and they started doing weirder and weirder classes, odder and things. Gary wanted to encourage classes, and he wanted to encourage thought where people would challenge their fears, work together in a collective sense, but without losing their individuality. And he believed that could be done. And I think that he specifically tried to design events so that would happen. And so Communiversity was a vehicle for him to, I believe, he's dead so he can't speak for himself, but I believe it was a vehicle for him to explore his own creativity, his own fears, and in the process of doing that, encourage other people to explore their fears and to expand their creativity to levels they had no idea that they could. I think in large part so that he could be part of that. I think he wanted to encourage people to do that, not totally out of selflessness at all, but because he wanted to grow. And he thought the best way to do that is to take a group of people, because you have a lot more power and strength when you have a group with a purpose, with a like mind. And he was very wary of standard stock collectivism at that time, stock socialist concepts, because he had been in communal political groups, and found them very difficult to organize. Found that the typical problems that everybody knows, like the stupidest and loudest people tend to get way more speech time or way more influence over a collective than people who are maybe quiet and thoughtful, as you're probably aware. And so I think Gary ran into that problem a couple times. So he's trying to organize a mechanism where people could explore their creativity, challenge their fears, without getting stuck in this stodgy, collective political stupidity that was rampant.
So this is mid '70s. Of course, there is no internet, there's no email, there's no mailing list. How did he recruit the people, and what were the people doing? How would he organize the events?
Communiversity recruited or got out to different people who might be interested in it using the cutting edge technology of the period, of course, which at that time were Gestetner printers. Gestetner printer is a big thing with a big round thing on it that you put ink into and run paper through, and it prints out periodicals or whatever. And that's how they printed their Communiversity calendars, with a Gestetner printer. They were shit-ass poor, so they couldn't go and buy like a $1,000 Gestetner printer, which would be the equivalent of a $10,000 Gestetner printer now. So what they did is they got one from a nonprofit company or like a group that they knew of, and the nonprofit group had bought it secondhand from a business. So it was an old funky technical device, that they could print their calendars on. And actually, if you want to do the video, I can show you some of the calendars. I've got them in my drawer right there at your knee. If you want to take a break for a second. The bottom one below that should have Communiversity in it. Is that it? Yeah. Or wait, maybe it's.
Maybe later.
Yeah, we can do it later. Anyway, I can show you those first if you want them for outtakes. But so they printed up these calendars of classes 3 times a year, and they would have between 80 and 200 classes, and then people would just come to them, and people would do them for free. They didn't cost any money, and so they started doing odder and odder classes. Gary was really interested in exploring the urban environment, so they do midnight walks through weird places. They do visit infrastructure sites, to see what was going on there. They'd also have classes like conversational French, theoretical physics, VW repair, how to make tofu. There was just a whole range. It could be anything. Clown classes, how to do clowning, mime class, makeup, how to do makeup. Also, at that period, it was the New Age period. It was kind of like in the second or third phase of the New Age period. So there was a lot of kind of just goofy baloney. It was kind of filtered throughout all this stuff. I mean, like little encounter group sessions and, pop psychology stuff where people would be in group settings and discuss. Some of the stuff had some value and some of it was probably, weird come-ons for, ideological groups or even cults maybe sometimes. And Gary tried to keep that sort of thing from infusing itself into Communiversity, because there was a lot of that going about at the time. Weird groups, political and kind of quasi-religious groups trying to recruit people at that time. Moonies, the Children of Light, all these kind of odd cults, very, very rampant at that time. So he thought, let's make a secret society that's kind of a play on a cult, and do weirder and weirder things. So he and several people, Adrian Burke, Nancy Prussia, and David Warren, they came up with this idea to start a group called the Suicide Club, which would do things that were even weirder than what they could get away with in Communiversity, because Communiversity had originally been a San Francisco State official adjunct, and after a certain period of time, SF State got so mad at what the weird class they were doing that Gary and his friends took Communiversity away from San Francisco State, made it into a non-profit school so they didn't have to answer to anyone, raised money to print their calendars by doing a garage sale 3 times a year, where everyone in Communiversity, there were 1,000 people on the mailing list, so it was a substantial mailing list, 1,500 people, and they would do this fundraiser where everyone would donate their used stuff, and they'd do a giant garage sale. So all the stuff for the garage sale was donated for free, and the philosophy of the garage sale was that they wouldn't charge money for this stuff. People could give whatever they wanted. So in other words, you'd have, let's say you had a nice pair of good sunglasses, Ray-Ban sunglasses that you might pay $20 for new at that time, and you'd have a pair of those there in good shape. People could pay whatever they wanted for it. They could pay 1 penny, they could pay $5. So what would happen with this philosophy, which is really interesting, this free, choose what you want to pay philosophy, is 1 out of 20 or 30 people would get a really good thing like a record player, a stereo that might be worth a lot, and they'd give $1 for it. So they're an asshole, but nobody would say that. They'd go, okay, $1, sure, the stereo, take it. And for every one person who did that, 30 people would get like a pair of glasses that might be worth $1, and they'd give $5 for it. So through that, they always raised enough money to pay for the calendar with this Gestetner printer that spit ink on your shirt when you were trying to print 1,000 calendars. Anyway, so it was a whole process. So we'd have mailing parties where everyone would get together and we'd mail this. We'd spend 10 people. We'd order pizza and coffee and we'd work all night. And then, of course, later when Kinko's, when he started getting copies, this is before copy. This is before you had mimeograph copies in stores. Okay, this is how long ago this is. So when that came along, we would do these mailing parties. We'd usually know somebody who worked at Kinko's, and we'd go to Kinko's at 3 in the morning, and we'd do it all there for really, really, really cheap. They give us a huge break, or maybe not even pay for the materials. But that's how we would print this stuff up and how we'd get the calendars out. So Communiversity then kept going, but Gary and his friends wanted to do more and more extreme events. And so they formed a club called the Suicide Club to do that. And the first group meeting of the Suicide Club was advertised as a class, okay, in the Communiversity calendar in January, February, winter, spring calendar of Communiversity in 1977. And I read that write-up. It was for the first Suicide Club initiation. They'd have, and a lot of this stuff was tongue-in-cheek. I mean, it was styled on secret societies and styled on, whatever, the Elks or the weird secret handshake clubs. But it was done a little bit tongue-in-cheek. They weren't quite totally serious. So an initiation, instead of bloodletting and strangling a turkey or whatever, you'd have an interesting event where people would then have been initiated into the club. And so the first Suicide Club event was an initiation. It was listed in the calendar. I went to it and I was still 17 at the time. I'd hitchhiked out here, and my friend Ron Unger, who I'd known, he lived out here, and I knew him from childhood. He was involved in Communiversity, and he was a pretty brilliant fellow, and he was teaching theoretical physics class, and he was teaching things that he was interested in as free classes for Communiversity, and he kept trying to get me to come and join these Communiversity outings. And I would look at the calendars, and even at that time I wasn't really a big joiner, like I wasn't big at joining things, and I'd read them and go, well, this sounds interesting, it looks like they do some fun things in these classes. Some of them might be of interest to me, but it never really got my attention until one time, a couple months later, they showed me the next Communiversity calendar, and it was the one that had the write-up for the Suicide Club in it. And I read that 2 or 3 paragraph write-up, and it was, I've said this many, many times before, I've never had a piece of writing speak more directly to me instantaneously and change that was a tipping point, and so in everyone's life there's one or 2 or 3 points where their entire life changes. Well, this was a point for me. It was obvious from the second that I read that and I go, this is exactly what I want to do. My God, who are these people? They must be amazing. And so I told Ron, like, wow, this is like, I read, we were, at that time we'd gotten an apartment together on Nob Hill, a 2-bedroom apartment that we rented for $200 a month on Nob Hill, because I had gotten a job, and we both had jobs, so we had money. So, and we didn't have any furniture yet, and we had nice new carpeting because they just restored the apartment before we moved in. And I'm reading this write-up, literally screaming and laughing and rolling back and forth across the floor. I thought it was so funny and so amazing and so audacious that somebody would claim that they're going to do these things. And Ron was just kind of standing in the doorway, kind of with his arms folded, kind of chuckling. He was an older guy, right? Kind of chuckling at me because he finally found something that would engage me, because he kept trying to get me to go out and meet people. And from the time I moved here, really all I did was, I partied on Haight Street a little bit, and then I walked everywhere. I kind of became a loner, and I just walked everywhere for several months. And then so he was really happy that he found something that would be of interest to me. So I went to meet these people because Ron had told me about them. He said, you should go meet these people, Gary Warren and Adrian Burke and David Warren. You should meet them. And I said, well, where would I? And he goes, where would I meet them? And he goes, well, Gary has a bookstore out in the Inner Sunset, and you can take the streetcar out there. So I went one afternoon I took the streetcar out there, and remember, I'm 17 and I'm a real macho kid from the Midwest, and I have this whole concept of, like probably much like viewing, like Navy SEALs or something, guys in all black suits rappelling in, that kind of thing. I had this whole fantasy about what being an adventurer would be, and that's what I wanted to do. So I thought, wow, I'm going to meet these guys who are doing the Suicide Club. How cool is that? So I show up at this bookstore, and it's this dingy little bookstore, a little hole-in-the-wall, shithole bookstore, Circus of the Soul Books. And I kind of go in, and it's kind of run down, and there's this funky desk, kind of like my desk here, and there's a guy behind it, and he looks like kind of a slightly overweight, big hippie guy with long hair, which is already discouraging. And then sitting next to him was like a really old guy, like he was super old guy, and in a big comfy chair, and he had a cane, and his leg was stuck out like that, and he had a cane, and he must have been, seemed like he was 100 years old. Turned out he was 42, but see, I was 17, so he might as well have been 100, right? So, and I come in and I'm looking around, and I'm kind of sketchy, and I go, hey, I'm looking for like these guys, Gary Warren and David Warren, and they look at me, they look at each other, they look at me, and I remember Gary had a plastic dart gun, like a plastic gun with a dart in it, and there's a chicken hanging from the ceiling, and he shot at the chicken and missed it. And then they kind of looked at me again. They didn't laugh or smile or anything, and they go, well, I'm Gary, and the old geezer said, well, I'm David. And so I was crestfallen. I was like, oh my God, these guys aren't adventurers. How could they do anything? They're like ancient. But I talked to them for a while, and I realized later, after I got to know these guys very well, that they were sizing me up like a piece of meat. Like, who's this kid? Is this kid going to join the Suicide Club? What's he going to do? Like, let's see what this kid will do. And so, so they signed me up. I signed up for the class, the Communiversity class, and then I came to this to Communiversity meeting a couple weeks later and met some other people. And then the first event for the Suicide Club met at the same bookstore about 2 or 3 weeks later. I showed up there at night, and the bookstore, Gary kept all these pillows up above the bookshelves, and he'd throw them on the floor, and they'd show movies in this place, in this little tiny bookstore. You could fit 60 people in there, like really tight. And he'd throw them on the floor, and that's how he'd have meetings, and this is how they'd have their little meetings and their discussions and their group group sessions and whatnot. And so we pile into this bookstore with about 60 people, you know, and Gary and Adrienne Burke, who's one of the founders of the club. She's this very small, very concise, very sharp woman, and really smart gal. And so they describe what they're going to do. Okay, we're going to blindfold you all, and then we're going to go to the initiation. And we've been told what to bring. We've been told to bring good boots and tough clothes and a potluck dinner, right, and a knapsack. So we were all blindfolded and trundled into these cars, vans, I don't know what, and I couldn't see anything. And I didn't know San Francisco that well. I mean, I'd been walking around a lot, but I'd only been here at that point, for maybe 7 or 8 months, 9 months. And we're driven somewhere, and we get out of the cars, and we're helped out because we're blind. We can't see what we're doing. And we walk across, you know, we all stand in line holding hands, right? And you can kind of feel, and you can hear people talking. And even though you're blind, your senses when you're blindfolded, by the way, become much more acute. You know, your smell and your hearing become much more acute, your sense of touch. So the woman on my right, you know, is, you know, I'm talking to her. I can't see her. I don't know what she looks like. And you know, we become very close because it's this intense, you know, like experience. And so over the course of the next hour or two, we were walked through some unknown area. We walk over some giant beam over a chasm of some type, you know, and it's, you know, we're told to be very careful not to fall off the beam as we're holding hands with other people. And we cross over, and then we start climbing these sand dunes, and then we climb these sand dunes in the, you know, blind, and then I can tell we've come into an underground chamber. We get to some point to the top of some hill, and we're by the ocean because I can smell the ocean. I can smell eucalyptus trees. And once again, these memories are very acute because it was such an overwhelming experience at that time. I'd never done anything like this in my life. I mean, I'd been an adventurous kid and a teenager, but I'd never done anything like this. So I have very vivid memories of this night. And Catherine, the woman I'm talking to, we're continue to talking. We become very, very friendly, very, you know, close. I didn't know, I was holding hands with some guy on the left. I don't remember who it was, but so we go into this bunker. We can feel and smell it. We've gone underground, and it's concrete. You can kind of feel the walls, and we go way underground, and then we hear this voice come out. We go, okay, you can take your blindfolds off now. And before they blindfolded us, they gave us all a pack of matches. Everyone, so all 50 of us had a pack of matches with us, you know, matches. And so this voice booms out of the darkness. Okay, you can take off your blindfolds now. So you take off your blindfolds. It's still dark. You can't see anything because we're in an underground chamber. So everybody lights their match. But so it turns out your pack of matches has one match in it, only one match. So we see these little flashes of light for about 5 seconds, and then it's total darkness again. And so then Catherine and I, still holding hands, we try to find our way out of this, into darkness, out of this underground bunker. And we can see a little point of light way off in the distance. It's a gray light. We start walking towards it, and we walk towards it, and as we get closer and closer, the light gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's just, there's a figure standing in this light. It's it's like a big outlet, a doorway to the outside world, and the figure's wearing flowing robes, and it's windy. You can see the robes blowing. And then before we get to the exit way, the figure walks away, and then Catherine and I walk out the door, walk at this big giant concrete square, you know, exit way, and we're on these cliffs above the ocean. And it turns out it was Fort Funston, which is a bunker down on the cliffs. And so then slowly over time, all these different people, 50 or 60 people, collect together, and we're gathered around in this little alcove and under the trees, and this ancient old kind of, you know, weird big kind of fat salesman guy, David Warren, is wearing this incredible cloak, and he's got you know, like this crazy hat on, and he's like, this booming stentorian voice collects all of us into this circle, and he goes, okay, everyone stand in a circle now, and we're all standing in a circle holding hands, and I'm like in an altered state of mind. There's no drugs, no alcohol, no chemical alteration, but I'm in an altered state of mind. And this guy who I really discounted as being, you know, just kind of a worthless old guy, right, is like leading this group, and it turns out he's a fire eater, and he's eating fire, and then he's touching everyone's hand with the flame in this like symbolic fashion, and then he passes around these bottles that are the bottles of life and death, right? And it's a sort of kind of goofy, cheesy ritual, but it was profound. You know, it was profound. You know, they weren't putting any, you know, no, they weren't trying to seem profound. It just was to me, and I think to many of the other people there. And so that was the first initiation in the Suicide Club. And David there, his booming voice leading us, you know, into the Suicide Club, and at that moment, from that point on, really from the point where I read the write-up, from that point on, all I did for the next 5 years was that. That's all I did. Suicide. All I did was do events. I started organizing events almost immediately, even though I was just a kid. Gary and David kind of took me and a few other people under their wing, and Adrian, and they, once again, you have to understand, this was an amateur group. See, these guys weren't experts. They weren't ninjas. They weren't Navy SEAL guys. They were just what they looked like. Gary was kind of a, at that point he would have been late 20s, hippie looking guy. He wasn't hippie at all. He had no hippie sensibility, but he had long hair. And David was a used salesman. He was a Fuller brush salesman, for Christ's sake. He'd done all these crazy sales jobs, and he was a talker. He was just a very incredible character, a real character, and so and so we started doing these events, and that's really all that I wanted to do. The first event that I organized was a sewer walk, an underground tunnel walk, and David and Gary and I did it together. I think they
San Francisco,
Oakland, and I think they did it because, but you have to understand, they didn't know what they were doing. Somebody would come up with an idea for an event, and we would just go do it. We had no idea. I mean, we took our cues from movies and from adventure fiction. Seriously, I mean, so we would go in the sewer. We didn't know what to do. And David remembered these tunnels from when he was a kid. He grew up in Hayward and in Oakland, and he remembered going into these big tunnels when he was a kid. So we went searching on a trip to find the tunnels that he went in when he was a kid. What at that point, 25, 30 years before. And we found them. And so here we are, David, who's got a gimp leg because he was in a car accident. We're walking along through these tunnels and exploring them, the three of us, so that we can do an event and bring 50 people there. And I started learning how to organize group events where you have to do the mechanics to get people from one place to another. You're breaking the law and doing stuff you're not supposed to do. People have to be safe. And we learned how to do this stuff as we went along. And I'll never forget, we were going through the sewer, and as we got closer and closer to the bay, downstream in this giant underground tunnel, it started filling up with silt, and the silt started getting higher and higher. And remember, David's walking along with his cane, and it's all of a sudden, it gets quite deep, the mud, and we're like this mud, and we're kind of sinking about that much in the mud. And then all of a sudden, David, who's once again, he's got a fucked up leg, he's walking along with his cane, and his cane sticks and goes into the mud, and he just like falls straight over into his face in the mud because he just it was really funny.
So sewer walk, what else? Climbing the Golden Gate Bridge?
Yeah, well, we did anything. We would do any infrastructure stuff. We climbed bridges. We went into San Francisco and Oakland. The Bay Area was replete with abandoned buildings at that time because the economy had changed from shipping and light industry, medium industry, and all that shit was closing down. So there were abandoned buildings everywhere, and so we used them for events. We would sneak into the buildings, and we had an aesthetic. We had a philosophy really about sneaking into places, and it came from Gary, really, and it was sort of like. But then grew around other people in a collective sense, where we would not damage the environments that we went into. In other words, even if we went into an abandoned building, we wouldn't steal anything from it. We wouldn't smash things. We wouldn't leave garbage. We wouldn't leave a pile of garbage there. So
leave no trace behind.
Yeah, it was a leave no trace thing. Yeah, that's where Burning Man Leave No Trace came from. Was the Suicide Club. The Burning Man Leave No Trace philosophy came directly from the people in that group, who then formed Cacophony.
So this lasted pretty much until
5 years.
5 years until
Gary died shortly. The Suicide Club disbanded, and Gary had already moved on to. He was doing a thing called the Guerrilla Grotto, and also the thing called the Answer Man newsletter. Gary was a de facto search engine, okay, and that's a true statement. He collected information about everything. And he kept files. You see, I have my file cabinets here. He had like 20 file cabinets, and he had started. He was always looking for some way to make a living because he didn't want to work some stupid job, and he didn't have much money, and so because he had so much information, he started a thing called the Answer Man newsletter, and he was looking to get a job possibly on a newspaper or in a magazine or something doing this, and he would have done that had he not died, but. He started to get a lot of press around his Answer Man scheme. You could write Gary Warren, or you could call him, and if you knew how to get a hold of him, he had flyers out, and there were articles about him. So he was starting to become known for this. And you would contact him, send him a letter, and ask him a question. And the question could be about, I like to use vampires. Let's say, are vampires real? Okay, you can send that question. And he wouldn't answer your question But what he would do is he would go into his files, which he had copious paper files of everything, and he would pick out articles about vampire groups, about academics who study, lycanthropy, about, villager groups, about rumors of actual vampires, about myths of vampires in the moors or whatever. And he would he would photocopy this stuff at that point, or run a print of it off on the Gestetner, and then later mimeograph it, and he would mail you as much information as he could get on the groups that knew about your topic, so that rather than answering your question, yes, of course vampires are real, or like, no, vampires aren't real, he would just send you all this information about how you could research it and find out as much as you'd like to about vampires. And it was a for-pay service. He charged for it, not very much, and so that was his budding career as a proto search engine. And the guy was brilliant. He was a genius. I do not say that lightly. I've worked with people who are routinely called visionaries in the press, and
no. At the same time, San Francisco was one of the key places for the punk rock scene.
Yes.
Was there any connection between
the punk rock scene and the Suicide Club? That's an interesting question, and yes, there was a little bit of crossover. The Suicide Club was about the most unhip, uncool group of people that you could collect together at all. There was nothing hipster about it. Gary was not a hip. David Warren, they were not cool, hanging out with the cool people. A good example would be, at one point, Gary and I both had part-time jobs working at the York Theater, which was a repertory movie house that was owned by these guys, and they showed old movies, like old Hitchcock films, old action films. And it was a kind of a thing at that time. Like, a lot of the old abandoned theaters had been bought by people because they're very cheap, and they could show old movies in them. So we worked at this place selling popcorn, and most of the other kids that worked there, or people who worked there, were new wave rock and roller kids, and they were super cool. They wore cool suits with the thin, skinny ties. They'd go see the Talking Heads when they played. They thought we were, they didn't hate us or dislike us, but they just thought we were kind of pathetic because we were so uncool. We'd come back from going in a sewer, and they go, "What are you going in a sewer for, man? We were down at the club." I'm serious. So why'd you want to do that? We were down at the club, hanging out, or down at Target Video or whatever. So there was some crossover. We went to the punk clubs. I remember being in Target Video several times. I went to the Def Club once, Club Foot, which was a really cool place. But we weren't punks. There were several people in the Suicide Club who were punks, who were crossover. Pierre Barral, Annie Coulter. Annie Coulter was really into the punk scene. She was one of the original, or one of the folks who's heavily involved in that scene here. Pierre and some other folks, but the Suicide Club was not a punk. It was not a hipster thing at all. And the punks weren't hipsters, but later the new wave kids were definitely hipsters. They were probably the proto hipsters.
Okay, so we're in the 80s, right?
We're in 80, 81, 82 now. Yeah.
Right. How do you transition to the Cacophony Society?
Well, the transition to the Cacophony Society.
Actually,